Hi, my name is Steve Holden, and I am running for New York 24th Congressional District, and this is my foreign policy gauntlet. I would support going back to the original lines drawn under the Palestinian Accords. I would return Gaza and the Golan Heights to the Palestinians, have it under full Palestinian control, and have it actually linked back to other Palestinian territory in other parts of the country, to where places such as the Gaza Strip is not completely isolated. I do not support the idea of encroaching Israeli settlements onto Palestinian territory, but carving out an area for the Israelis to have their own independent state. One can both oppose the government of Israel, but support the idea of a Jewish state there. I support full and territorial rights back to the Palestinians, and the curtailing of any sort of aid that can be used against the Palestinian peoples. We also have to look to curtail the terrorist organizations that might be in that area and find a peaceful solution via going back to the original accords. Palestinian people are some of the most oppressed on the earth, and they need to give their territory back, but still carve out a small area there for the Israelis. Because again, we understand why the Israeli state came into fruition, because of the atrocities that happened after World War II. So I support some area there in Israel, but mainly giving a lot of that property back to the Palestinian people, but in the original accords. I am a unique candidate in that I am a retired Army finance officer who teaches finance and contracting to the federal government. I have been working on the area of DoD audit since 2012, and I fully support being able to audit the Pentagon. So I support the bipartisan Audit the Pentagon Act of 2021. What are the problems with the DoD audit? Well, I could be on here all day talking about it. But one, it has to do with the culture change. DoD in and of itself has to be able to want to be audited. Secondly, it has to audit the financial systems. The financial systems are all over the place. The DoD, when an attempt to be audited, has received what is called a disclaimer, which means when an auditor goes in, this is when they have absolutely no idea what's going on. They're supposed to be at what is called an unqualified audit, which means unqualifiably the systems, the documents, and the processes are all auditable. And unqualified means 100% or near 100%, whereas qualifiable means about 95%. So I support them going into an unqualified audit. Now, part of that process will have to do also with acquisition reform. And part of my plan, which is called the Green New Deal for Central New York, we would reform government contracting, particularly in DoD, to reduce the amount of what are called cost reimbursement contracts. Those are contracts that are variable and cause the most amount of cost overrun. And actually, people inside of the Pentagon would support this sort of idea. This would actually free money, by this audit and by this proposed change to federal acquisition regulations, would free up approximately 10% of the DoD budget to be able to support such ideas as free public college for up to 2 years and support the maintaining of the ideas within Build Back Better. So I'm sitting in a unique position to actually be someone who has worked on the DoD audit and absolutely and wholeheartedly support its passage and holding the Pentagon's feet to the fire. And I would be someone who would actually know how to do it. Well, our military spending should never be above 5% of gross domestic product. We're hovering there now because the way that we do war financing, which I'll talk about in another topic coming up here, is not put into our baseline budget. I would support the reduction of DoD spending to exceed no more than 3% gross domestic product. Once we do that, we can fill that gap. Now, the problem within DoD is always a decision of, do we get new equipment or do we maintain what we have? Well, we're already at a technological advantage. So where could we take some of that money that's going into some of the bloated projects, some of which DoD doesn't even want, and where do we redirect it? So I would require a complete top-down review of what is called the defense acquisition system to completely review the way that the military does acquisitions. We can reduce the amount of percentage of GDP from 5 to 3 by simply doing that, because about 20% of military spending are in areas that can be significantly curtailed. Another way that we can do that is take nation building and peacekeeping out of DoD and actually put it in Department of State and USAID. By doing that, you're going to put it in the hands of career diplomats who can actually more adequately be able to handle the idea of nation building. Take it out of DoD, put it in Department of State and USAID. And the other net piece that we can do is actually changing some of those things from getting in the hands of weapons manufacturers. I have taken the Code Pink pledge not to take any sort of money from defense contractors and nor from the NRA. What I've also proposed is taking some of that money within DoD and actually using it on soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to allow their family members coverage under TRICARE for dental and vision. It's something that a whole lot of people do not know about a military coverage, is that sometimes the dependents, if they need critical care that have to do with vision and dental, that it is not covered, just basic checkups, not like anything else. So those are some of the ideas I have to do to reform military spending. I would like to ban the use and the creation of nuclear weapons across the globe. It is not only just a threat to humanity, but of any sort of life across the planet. My plan to denuclearize is to renegotiate with a roundtable of all nuclear powers across the world to have a summit to where we agree to reduce nuclear weapons by 10% over the next decade. We have hotspots all over the world that are directly related to either the potential threat of nuclear weapons or the actual possession of nuclear weapons. So this would force countries such as North Korea, India and Pakistan, and Iran, who would like to create a nuclear weapon, to come to the table and work on denuclearization. Now that's all parts of the nuclear triad. So that's both dealing with submarine, airborne, and land-based nuclear weapons. Once we're able to do that, then we can put a permanent ban on nuclear weapons across the globe and take away the whole idea, not just of nuclear weapons, but of push-button warfare, which gets into drone warfare. It could get into a Accord on outer space and stop the space race of getting larger scale weapons that can cause mass destruction across the globe. So again, it's not just nuclear weapons, but other ones that really dehumanize warfare and actually force nations to actually put boots on the ground so their citizenry can actually see what the cost of true warfare is. As someone who spent almost 5 years of his life in uniform in combat zones, I think this would put more of a face on it with the public. I would support the idea of a war tax or the reorganizing of the budget to switch from supplemental budgets funding wartime operations to putting them into baseline operations. There are other politicians who, throughout the past 15 years, such as former Congressman Alan Grayson, who is now running for Senate in Florida, with whom he and I have talked about co-sponsoring a bill which would change up the way that wartime financing is done. Currently, it's done through supplemental appropriations. What the public may or may not know is that the wartime spending bill is a separate bill from the regular financing of the Pentagon. What I talked about before in a previous part of this gauntlet was the way that DoD spending works. Well, wartime spending isn't a part of that. Okay, it's through a supplemental appropriation, much the same way that we take care of pandemics, infrastructure repair, or natural disasters that occurred. That aid is also supplemental spending. We don't get that in our baseline appropriations. I would support either one, a war tax, or two, preferably switching to baseline appropriations to curtail the plan to go to war. If there is such a situation where our nation is attacked and we do need to use the armed forces, then Congress would have the power to, via war tax instead, be able to fund an appropriation like that. But putting it in the idea of supplemental appropriation is nothing more than swiping the credit card and passing the cost of war on to future generations. So I would support changing the funding mechanism of the way that DoD finances wartime operations. I would support the idea of ending forever wars. Like I've said before in this gauntlet, I'm a 5-time combat vet, and I've seen the way that it works. Congress must take back the idea of declaring war. And unless there are exigent circumstances where the country is under immediate attack, we should declare that back to Congress as our founding fathers intended it. Under 9/11, we were under those auspices. But Congress needs to, if there is an initial problem, still come back and declare war. And only in declared wartime operations, with the consent of both houses of Congress, should we then further appropriate money the way that I've talked about in the previous part of this gauntlet to fund those operations. But that needs to come back to Congress, both the idea of the power of the purse string and to actually declare war. Another thing, like I've talked in other parts of this gauntlet, is the idea of ending nation building. There are things that are in DoD which need to be moved from DoD to Department of State and USAID. That doesn't need to be there. We should not be in the nation building game. If there is a conflict because we have been attacked, then we need to end that operation as soon as we can and force the Pentagon to come via the president and brief Congress on exactly how, and it can be done in open session or behind closed doors if it's classified, to explain what the intent and the end state of the operation is. As someone who sat on the ground in Iraq and who wondered how long we were going to be there, I understand what it's like to be a service member on the other end of that foreign policy, not knowing exactly how long you're going to be deployed. So we have to understand what that end state is. The fully nation building should not be in the hands of the Department of Defense. It should transition to phase 5 immediately after stability has been done, back to civilian authorities within the country, not having 20 years of occupation like we did in Afghanistan and about 7 to 8 years of occupation that we did in Iraq. As someone as a combat vet, this issue means a lot to me. So that is my position on ending forever wars and Congress taking that power back and shifting responsibility to different parts of the federal government. That is my opinion of ending forever wars.